G'day everyone, welcome to another episode of Wineback Wednesday. And as we head towards the end of the year, obviously the festive and New Year season is looming upon us. And often through that period, through Christmas and New Year, we catch up with family and friends and celebrate and have all sorts of foods and all sorts of wine. But obviously I'm going to be talking about this particular wine today. It's the Pedra Branca Vintage Fortified, which we make with a dear friend. And excuse me, there's a few flies. And obviously will go very, very well with Christmas cake. But we call it Vintage Fortified these days because traditionally we called them port or vintage port, depending on which style. So vintage port or vintage fortified come from one particular vintage, whereas tawnies and ruby ports often come from multiple vintages and a blend. But we're not allowed to use those terms, a lot of those terms anymore, because the old world obviously have them now as protected, such like as champagne and Burgundy, and obviously port. Port originally comes from Portugal on the Western Europe and Western Europe. And but we are still things like Muscat, which is a fortified wine as well, which we can still call that, but Tokay is now called Topaque in Australia. So there are some terms obviously that are protected and we aren't able to utilise them in Australia and obviously other new world countries or outside of those, or any of those regions outside of the original regions that had those protected names. We are using Portuguese varieties, or as they often called, Iberian varieties, and it is predominantly Touriga nacional, Tinta cow and Tinta negra mole. So three very well respected Portuguese varieties, and we ferment it to a certain point. We bring it in, we process it like a red, and we pick it at a reasonably low potential alcohol. So the fruits are about 13.5 BOMA, which roughly equates to about 13.5% alcohol, maybe a little bit higher. But it gets fermented to a certain extent, and we look at it, and we work out roughly how much sweetness we'd like. And when we hit that point, we then fortify it. We use an aged brandy spirit and also an ex-still brandy spirit, and we put that in there. We arrest the fermentation, and then we press it off. We check the alcohol again, and we adjust it to whatever level that we want. Sometimes you aim for a particular number, but then you taste it, and obviously alcohol has an inherent sweetness of its own, and obviously there's heat associated with it. So sometimes you balance it out, and sometimes you think you might want to go to 17.5%, but this one, for example, is 16.7%. So I think if we probably did it on the bench trial a little bit higher, might have been a little bit too warm and sweet per se. And this one's only about 45 grams per litre of sugar. So this is the 2018. We don't really sell a lot of it. We only make a tiny bit of it, and I think it's I've had the idea of just using it maybe occasionally at the cellar door, some dinners when we host them, as a nice finish to the end of the evening, and a bit of personal consumption as well. So it's matured once it's been pressed off and fortified, it then goes into stainless steel and sits on gross lees, and for about 8 or 9 months, I think it was, or 10 months, and then it is cleaned up and bottled as is. Sometimes people use it in oak, and often it is in stainless steel. So as a number of years ago, when I was working at Two Hands Wines, we had a grower who had a small section of Tinta Amarela, which is another Portuguese variety, and we didn't really know what to do with it. And I love for distillation and fortification when I went through Rosebery, the agricultural college, part of the University of Adelaide. And so I suggested, why don't we make a little bit of a VP, or vintage fortified, at the time. And there was another gentleman, David Baverstock, whose parents lived in the Barossa, and he'd been he was a bit older than me, and he'd been working in Portugal, consulting and working with various port houses over there for several decades. And I knew he was back in town. It was probably around Christmas time, actually, because I was sort of preparing to what I was going to do a few months later with this Tinta Amarela. And I sat down with him and asked him about how to make vintage fortifieds, and he sort of gave me a bit of a rough idea, but he preferred styles that were matured for a number of months in stainless steel, just to retain that freshness and vibrancy. So without further ado, and we made obviously the Tinta Amarilla. I think we did a couple of vintages of it. But without further ado, let's give this one a crack. So if you look at Touriga Tinta Amarilla, which I was talking about when I was in the Barossa, that was a bit of a workhorse variety, and maybe a bit of a lesser grape in the scheme of things, whereas Touriga Nacional, Tinta Cow, Tinta Negra Mole are three of the, I suppose what you sort of say, more prestigious Portuguese varieties that they use. So lovely colour, and really some cloves, some nice red fruits, plums, some spice, some lift, and there's that sort of a brandy spirit has this sort of extra level of dimension, whereas often neutral spirit, as the name suggests, is quite neutral and doesn't really have much notes on the nose. It's often neutral spirit might have a slight sort of peppery, sort of sweet note to it on the nose, sort of lifted note, but other than that, there's no real complexity or them. Whereas brandy spirit, especially if it's been aged, often has a lot more complexity to it and more interesting, more savoury, lifted aromas, and some sort of various other compounds that may have come out of the distillation process. Straight away on the palate, there is an element of sweetness to it. It's only 45 grams per litre of sugar, so if you, it's probably on the lower side, but I think it is a pretty balanced style. There's good acidity. The alcohol's there, but I think it's just suggesting a little bit of sweetness on the palate. There's no warmth per se, and at 16.7% alcohol. I mean, some table wines in New World countries in particular are up around that level and naturally. So this is probably came in to be, as I said, about 13.5% potential alcohol, and we've just tweaked it up a few more percent, probably about, yeah. So 45 grams per litre of residual sugar. Obviously has been a bit of a dilution, obviously, after you've added the spirit, but overall 45 grams per litre of sugar will roughly give you 2.5% alcohol. So so if it was 13.5, probably finished about 10 or 11, 10.5 ish, and then we fortified it, which then diluted everything back out and raised that alcohol up. And yeah, that would definitely go with a nice Christmas pudding with some brandy cream, and have a glass of that on the side maybe, and or even with some cheese. End of the meal, sit down there, sit on the couch, a piece of cheese, a book, open, look at your presents for the Christmas day, and have a bit of fun. So there we are, the Pedra Branca 2018 vintage fortified. Cheers.